Well, thanks for having me again this year. I really always enjoy this. I'm not going to give you a fire and brimstone speech because what they've asked me to talk about is rather dull, actually. So I'm going to try to make it less dull. Now, you're never supposed to say that to your audience in public speaking because everybody goes running out the door. But what they've asked me to talk about is the presidents that should be on Mount Rushmore. And when I was up in New York, I wrote the book, as he just mentioned, Recarving Rushmore, Ranking the Presidents on Peace, Prosperity, and Liberty in 2009. Well, of course, Obama had just took office when the book came out, so I didn't have Obama in it. Well, I just released a revised edition with Obama in it, and it's hot off the presses, and so that's what I'm really going to be talking about. But they want me to talk about who should be on Mount Rushmore, so I'm going to do that. And when I was at the Big Book Expo at the Javits Center a month or so ago up in New York, a lot of people were there getting me to sign their books, and this guy comes up to me and he was speaking in an accent, and he goes, "I don't think your plan is very sound." He said, "It would cost a lot of money to recarve that mountain, wouldn't it?" And of course, the line was pretty amused by this, so I had to explain to them that this was just metaphorical and that I was really re-ranking the presidents and on the basis of whether they followed the Constitution or whether their policies promoted peace, prosperity, and liberty. And of course, I get much different rankings in the book than most historians, political scientists, and journalists. I have ranked them as I thought the founders would have ranked them had they been back to see them all in all their glory. Now, the four that I'm going to talk about who should be on Mount Rushmore, 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the book, they're not very colorful guys. About the most colorful thing that happened on the four of them is Grover Cleveland fathering a child out of wedlock and then stunning everybody by just saying, "Yeah, I did it," you know. And so who would, Bill Clinton should take lessons from him, I guess. But historians, political scientists, and journalists regularly have several biases that they use when they evaluate presidents and rank them. And you always see presidential rankings. And curiously, conservative and liberal rankings are pretty similar. And the first bias that they have is effectiveness versus success. Effectiveness is, did you do what you said you were going to do? So if you said you were going to take over the entire country and make it a socialist state, and you did that, then you should get a high ranking. And some of the rankings do indicate that. FDR, of course, and Woodrow Wilson are both ranked very highly. So I say success is limiting the government, sticking with the Constitution, etc. So you can't take politics or your political views or ideological views out from evaluating presidents, but historians try to do by this effectiveness standards. The second standard that they use is charisma. Teddy Roosevelt is a classic example. William McKinley was a much more important president, I think, than Teddy Roosevelt, but of course, and he was really a pioneer for a lot of the things that Roosevelt did, but Roosevelt had a big personality. You know, he was hunting and all this sort of stuff, big game hunting. He was leading charges up the hill before he became president, and he was just one of our more colorful presidents, and the press loved him, and he loved the press. So of course, he's gotten good press throughout history, but he wasn't a very good president. So historians and political scientists, et cetera, they're suckers for charisma, including great rhetoric and great speeches. The third one, and this is a big one, service during a crisis or war. It doesn't matter if the president contributed to the crisis, caused the crisis, or didn't do much other than send the troops to defuse the crisis. And the last one, of course, is activism. Now, that can usually be, Republicans would say, well, there's a Democratic bias, but actually there's a bias on activism which cuts across the Republican side too, with foreign intervention and that sort of thing, big law enforcement, et cetera. In fact, party affiliation has surprisingly little to do with my rankings. In fact, there's some very substantial surprises, and I tried to evaluate the presidents in their time. And a lot of presidents didn't even follow their party's principles, which in some cases was good. And one of the presidents that I'll talk about here did that. He violated every every principle that his party stood for on purpose. So I'm going to try to first be upbeat, and then if I have any time left, I'm going to talk about the worst president in U.S. history, which has relevance to the situation in Iraq and Syria today, because he helped create that situation. Now, the four presidents that I'm going to talk about in order, descending the way I ranked them from 1 to 4, John Tyler, Grover Cleveland, Martin Van Buren, and Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, many of the people have never heard of these people, but boring is beautiful if you're a libertarian sometimes, because these guys did try to follow the Constitution. They had the old concept of the president, which was what the founders had intended, that he executes the law, the Congress is supposed to be the strongest branch, etc. And of course, that doesn't mean these guys are perfect. They're not perfect libertarians. John Tyler, he was a Whig, and that's the precursor to the Republican Party. And of course, at the time, the Democrats were the small government party, and the Whigs and the Republicans were the big government party. Now I would say both parties are big government. But he was a Whig, but he vetoed the revival of the National Bank. He was expelled from his party, and most of his cabinet resigned. And he had taken over from William Henry Harrison, whom I didn't rank, but I guess some people would say he's the greatest president of the United States, since he only survived 1 month in office and didn't have time to screw anything up. But I'm not that cynical. But the guy who took over for him for the rest of the time, I have him as 1, because he was really an unelected president without a party, and you can't get any weaker than that. But then he topped it off by, he then vetoed a bill to raise taxes. Therefore, his party tried to impeach him. Now, his party failed, but of course, he wasn't going to get reelected, right? He favored a tight monetary policy based on sound currency. He was basically a Democrat of the time, which was small government, and he only joined the Whig Party because he, like many other Whigs, because he hated the big government activism of Andrew Jackson. So in sum, he blocked his own party's program of national banks, high tariffs, federal funding of infrastructure improvements, and federal aid to states. And he protected the states from federal meddling. Now, most of that program from the Whigs was transferred to the Republicans when Abraham Lincoln got elected, and continued through into the next century. I think John Tyler was very courageous, not only for limiting government, but committing political suicide to do it. And he also settled the longest and bloodiest Indian War by letting the Seminoles stay on the reservation, or the remaining Seminoles who were there, rather than pushing them, ethnically cleansing them west. And he also used restraint in putting down a rebellion by not calling an insurrection, and it resulted in more voting rights for the people of Rhode Island. Now, his big negative, and all these guys have negatives, was he didn't really follow his strict constructionist view. When he admitted Texas, you're supposed to get a treaty by 2/3 of the Senate, because Texas was an independent state and they were coming into the U.S., so you have to have a treaty. He just got a majority of both houses, which is a violation of the Constitution. Now, Grover Cleveland, he had much of the same, many of the same policies. He thought the executive, he was so restrained. In fact, might have even been too restrained with the executive, because the Congress had passed this law increasing the money supply by coining silver, and he said, I don't really, have the power as president to recommend that they repeal that. So he didn't. And so I think he probably did, because the Constitution does say that the president can suggest legislation. The Congress doesn't have to pass it. But so he might have even been, and you don't see that very often, that an executive is too restrained in his power. But that's one instance. Now, he, for the most part, promoted limited government, a restrained executive branch, tight money, anti-colonialism. He took Benjamin Harrison's treaty that annexed Hawaii, and of course, U.S. businessmen had got the Marines to overthrow the government in Hawaii, and he thought that was colonialism. And it does seem like colonialism, so he withdrew the treaty from the Senate, and of course, they later annexed Hawaii, but he was for a non-interventionist foreign policy for the most part. He had his little incident in Venezuela. He was a little excessive in enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, but generally followed a policy of non-intervention. He vetoed more special interest bills than any other president, well, all presidents coming before him, which is a really big thing, right? Unlike his successor McKinley, he faced the same situation with the Cuban rebellion against Spanish power. Of course, McKinley went to war for it, Spanish-American War, which heralded U.S. imperialism overseas. Cleveland avoided doing that under the same circumstances. Of course, there was a recession during Cleveland's term, and instead of being an activist, he let the economy right itself by a tighter monetary policy to the extent that he could, given what Congress had done. So one of the big things back then was the Civil War had such an egregious pension system after it that it became a big scandal. And that actually delayed the onset of the welfare state in America because of this. Everyone was covered under the Civil War pensions. And he had paid to get out of the Civil War, which you could do if you had money back then. So it was very courageous for him to oppose these veterans benefits, which he did. He vetoed those. And now, he did have some negatives. The Venezuela incident, enforcing the Monroe Doctrine, he got a little belligerent with the British. Fortunately, the British had enough problems on their hand, and they compromised and sent the message and had the issue arbitrated. He also reduced taxes, but in exchange for bringing back the income tax. Now that's a bad thing. The next year it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, as it should have been, as the way the Constitution read then. One of his worst things was he signed the Interstate Commerce Act, which created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which regulated railroad rates. And of course that was the first regulatory agency in US history. And then he busted the Pullman strike. And so he was not completely clean either, but he's pretty good. Now, Martin Van Buren is number 3, and Rutherford B. Hayes is number 4. They would have been 1 and 2, except for one issue. They had really bad Indian policies. And otherwise, they were very, very good. Unlike Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, Van Buren actually practiced limited government. And again, he was for states' rights, limiting executive authority, et cetera. And he kept us out of 4 different wars, two with British over Canada and 2 with Mexico. And that's very significant because most historians, you get credit if you went to war. But you never hear about the champions, the presidents who championed peace and kept us out of war. And Van Buren is the absolute champion of that. And if you believe that war leads to big government and is the biggest cause of big government in US history and in world history, not only in the national security area, but domestic programs such as Social Security directly came out of war. The income tax came out of war. The estate tax came out of the war. There's a long list of programs. And of course, the New Deal came out of World War I. So if you believe that, Van Buren should get very high marks because of his, his avoidance of war. He was always seeking a way out through arbitration, et cetera. Now, also in the panic of 1837 was a severe recession. He decided to let the economy right itself, and it did. And so I think it righted itself quicker than it would have if he had adopted what his predecessor and political soulmate, Andrew Jackson-style activism. But Van Buren was a different sort of character. Economist Jeffrey Hummel says that Van Buren established the best banking system in US history. That was the independent treasury, which allowed the deregulation of banking, and it ripped out for a while, most of Alexander Hamilton's financial regulatory apparatus, which had existed since early in the Republic. Van Buren also declared opposition to foreign alliances, and he also refused Texas bid. He was the president before Tyler, effectively, because Harrison only served 1 month. And of course, Tyler succumbed and brought Texas in, but Van Buren refused Texas bid to be annexed after it became an independent country. He knew that annexing Texas would rile Mexico, exacerbate American regional balance and tensions by admitting a slave state, and split the Democratic Party. And of course, James Polk later did all these things by going to war with Mexico to steal its territory, and of course, thereby the Mexican War later caused the Civil War. Now, negatives, it's a fairly big negative, and it's really the only thing that Van Buren did wrong, but it was really wrong, and that is that Jackson had already ethnically cleansed the Indians to the unappealing Indian Territory. And I'm not going to tell you what state that is because I'll insult some people. But anyway, it was very unappealing to go there. And so Van Buren had the Army escort these Cherokees 1,000 miles to a new desolate home. However, the government didn't spend much money on doing it, and inclement weather caused thousands of them to die from hunger, disease, or exposure on the Trail of Tears. He also was more aggressive on the Seminole and fought the longest and costliest Indian War in U.S. history, which cost the lives of 2,000 U.S. soldiers and countless more Indians. Now, Rutherford B. Hayes, the last president I'm going to talk about, he was a Republican in the late 1800s, and the Republican Party in the late 1800s was for a national bank, high tariffs, both of those to fund internal improvements. Read pork projects such as roads, canals, etc. So at the time, the Republican Party was the big party of big government, but Rutherford B. Hayes was a fiscal conservative, and he was largely non-interventionist in foreign policies. And he did one major thing that very few presidents have done. During his campaign, he said, look, I'm just going to serve one term because I just think that power should be changed out. So that's what he did. He served one term, and he limited his term, and therefore he limited his power by doing that. He also improved relations with Mexico, and when Congress passed the law expanding money by authorizing silver coinage, he did everything that he could to minimize the effect because he was a hard money, gold standard type of guy. He paid U.S. debts, restored the national credit, and reduced taxes. And so he didn't really go with the Republican program, just like Tyler didn't go with the Whig program, which was the precursor to the Republican program. He also used more restraint than Cleveland did in putting down a labor strike. He didn't bust the strike, he just sent troops to protect federal facilities. And he also knew that Reconstruction, and to see if there's any parallel to the current situation, imposing your will by military occupation, if the inhabitants don't really want to do it, is futile no matter how good the cause was. And so he finally said, Reconstruction is not working. We've got to withdraw the remaining troops from the South. And he knew that black rights were going to suffer, but there was no way that there was nothing he could do because the federal troops only remained in 2 states. So he did his best. He was an advocate of black rights, and he did his best, given the bad circumstances that he had, to stick up for African American rights. But he really didn't have too much of anything he could do about it. Now, he did also improve. He tried to take the politics out of the government because back then politicians would charge federal bureaucrats part of their salary to use on political campaigns. So he reduced the government, and then he tried to make the remaining government less political. Now he went from number 2 to number 4 in my book because he used force to put down several Indian uprisings. We all know the Little Bighorn, but very few of us know why the Little Bighorn happened. The massacre at Little Bighorn happened. Well, George Custer, who had massacred many Indians in his time, he was one of many officers out in South Dakota and Montana. And what they were doing was they were protecting miners who were stealing gold on Indian land. And the Indians were not happy about that. And so after this massacre at Little Bighorn, of course, there was the entire country wanted blood, and so U.S. Grant and Hayes Army forced the Sioux and the Cheyenne onto reservations, and in a very martial way. And of course, the reservations were abysmal. The same thing happened, the pattern happens in American history. Whenever gold is discovered on Indian land, they're told to move, to get out of there, and that also happened in Oregon and Nebraska and Dakota. So Hayes's policy was probably no worse than Grant's, but nonetheless, it has to be counted against him. Now I'm going to talk for the last few minutes here about Woodrow Wilson. He was the worst president in my book because he ruined the entire 20th century, and he's now working on the 21st. Most of the problems that we have in the Middle East now are associated with World War I, the single most important event in World War II, or I mean in the 20th century. People talk about World War II, we see it on the History Channel, that sort of thing, and that's because we have veterans that are still living who watch the History Channel that fought in World War II. But World War II should be called World War I Part II. And I'm not denigrating the people who served in it. It wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had Hitler. We wouldn't have had the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, the Cold War, or the killing of 110 million people of wars in the 20th century if we hadn't had World War I. And we wouldn't have most of those things if Woodrow Wilson hadn't sent the U.S. into World War I. So how does this relate to today? Well, first of all, a lot of these problems in the Middle East were caused by the fall of the Ottoman Empire during World War I, and France and Britain dividing up the spoils. And they did it very artificially so they could get the oil, particularly the British, but it caused the problem in Iraq. But the French were also at fault there as well. But they drew the boundaries arbitrarily that didn't match ethno-sectarian lines. So you have an ethno-sectarian mix in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, all those countries, and that's what's causing the problem that we have now. The second thing is that people talk about this ISIS group, and we talk as if we have Munich 1938. If we appease anyone, we must stamp out the threat anywhere in the world, no matter how small. Otherwise, it's going to snowball into Hitler. We called Serbia, Milosevic of Serbia, Hitler. We called Saddam Hussein Hitler. We called Muammar Gaddafi Hitler. Now you see the comparisons of Hitler to ISIS. Hitler had the biggest economy in Europe behind him, and he was trying to take over a very important technologically and economic area, Europe, not the Middle East. And so the threat is being exaggerated, but also let's adopt the World War I mentality here and look at World War I. If we use the World War I paradigm instead of the World War II paradigm, we get a much different result. And it seems that recent history bears that out. What I mean by the World War I paradigm is, if the United States hadn't intervened in World War I, we wouldn't have had all this string of World War II, the Bolshevik Revolution, the Cold War, etc. So perhaps we should blame the current state of affairs on the U.S. invasion of Iraq during the Bush administration. That's what caused al-Qaeda in Iraq to form. That's what caused terrorism to increase worldwide, and also that now morphed into ISIS. So if we use the same paradigm, the World War II paradigm gets us to more intervention. If we use the World War I paradigm, anytime anybody says to you, well, yeah, we've got to nip this in the bud, or it's good, they're coming home to get us, that's based on the Munich 1938, that you can't ignore anything that happens in the world. Well, given the old World War I example, which you don't learn in your high school history books, and say, if we hadn't gotten into World War I, there wouldn't have been a Hitler. I think that you can easily turn the tables on that from intervention to non-intervention. And I think history can teach us something, although it's very difficult for Americans to even remember Afghanistan and Iraq. It seems like we're going down the same failed road of preventive war and training people who are going to give their guns to somebody else and run away. So I think history can teach us something, and I hope that we can use the right historical examples instead of the wrong ones. Thanks for your attention.